The warm, fermented dark air of the Horseshoe Brewery on Tottenham Court Road pressed against every surface on the afternoon of the 17th of October 1814 heat, rising from the porter vats in slow, invisible columns. The smell of malt thick enough to taste, the low subsonic presence of hundreds of thousands of gallons of liquid held in suspension inside wooden walls 60 hoops thick, and George Crick, storehouse clerk, stood on his inspection platform and looked down at the iron hoop that had slipped, a 700-pound band of forged metal lying against the base of a 22-foot wooden vat, like a shed skin. And he did what 17 years of experience had taught him to do. He noted it, climbed down, and began writing a note to the partner on duty, because hoops slipped 2 or 3 times a year, always had, and nothing had ever come of it. The vat above him held 10 months of aging, porter pressing outward against staves and iron, with the slow, patient force of 570 tons of liquid, and that force had nowhere to go but into the wood, into the metal, into the mortar at the base, into the fatigue accumulating invisibly in each hoop that remained, and to understand why the next hour would erase 2 houses from the earth, kill 8 people, and drive a 15-foot wave of black fermenting liquid through one of London's most densely packed slums at a speed that left no interval between warning and consequence, you have to go back to 1809. When Sir Henry Mew purchased the Horseshoe Brewery, looked at what his father had built at the Griffin Brewery in Liquor Pond Street, and decided he would build something larger. That is where the machine was born. That is where the logic that made the flood inevitable was first written down in timber and iron. Sir Richard Mew had constructed the largest vat in London at the Griffin Brewery, a vessel capable of holding 20,000 imperial barrels, and it had made him famous in the trade. A proof of concept that concentrated scale in a single vessel was not recklessness, but engineering ambition, a rational response to the economics of porter production, where aging time was fixed by chemistry, and the only variable the brewer truly controlled was volume. His son understood the lesson completely. When Henry Mew took possession of the Horseshoe Brewery in 1809, the operation was producing roughly 40,000 barrels a year. It was a respectable number. It was not enough. London's population was growing without pause. Porter was the most popular alcoholic drink in the capital, and the economics of the trade were unambiguous. The brewer with the largest vessel aged the most product simultaneously, controlled the most margin, and occupied the strongest position against his competitors. Within 2 years of Henry Mew's ownership, production at the Horseshoe Brewery climbed past 100,000 barrels annually, a figure confirmed in trade records for the 12 months leading to July 1812, when the brewery logged 102,493 imperial barrels in a single year. That number required storage. Storage at that scale required a vat of a size the brewery had not yet attempted. In 1810, Henry Mew commissioned and installed a wooden fermentation vessel 22 feet tall, the dimensions borrowed directly from his father's ambition, reinforced with iron hoops totaling 81 metric tons of forged metal, capable of holding 18,000 imperial barrels of porter at a single fill. It was the largest single vessel on the brewery floor. Engineers of the period had no formalized structural calculation method for understanding how cyclical fill and drain loads stressed timber staves over years of repeated use. The vat was assessed by eye, by tradition, and by the testimony of similar vessels that had not yet failed. That assessment was called engineering. It looked like control. It was not control. It was the accumulated confidence of a system that had not yet reached its limit, and confidence in a structure of that mass and consequence is not a substitute for a number. The logic of the vat was, on its own terms, perfectly rational. Porter required months of aging, the finest batches held for nearly a year, their flavor deepening through continued biological activity within the vessel and the wooden container was the only proven technology of sufficient scale to hold that aging mass in a single location without interruption. Heat was applied carefully. Gravity moved the finished product through the floor plan to distribution. The fermentation process was self-contained and self-evident. its chemistry visible in the slow movement of gas through the bungholes and the periodic deep groan of timber, expanding under thermal and hydraulic load. The iron hoops were the critical system. 60 of them, some weighing 700 pounds each, banded the staves together and transferred the outward pressure of the liquid into circumferential tension, a design as old as cooperage itself, proven across centuries of barrel making, scaled upward by a factor of magnitude that no one in the trade had systematically examined at that size or under those repeated load cycles. The central irony was absolute, and it requires stating plainly. The vat was considered the safest, most controlled, most carefully monitored system on the entire brewery floor. It was insulated, filled deliberately to a known capacity, sampled at regular intervals by men who had tended it for years. It was not a steam boiler under explosive pressure. It had no volatile chemical charge. Its contents were dense and slow-moving, compared to the combustible materials that endangered other industrial operations of the early 19th century. The danger was not dramatic. The danger was arithmetic. Every gallon of porter added to the vessel represented additional hydrostatic load pressing outward against the staves, the hoops, and the mortar at the base. Every successful fill was treated internally as a proof of safety rather than as an accumulation of unrecorded structural stress. Every year that passed without catastrophe was a year in which no one measured the fatigue developing invisibly in the iron bands, in the timber joints, in the rivet holes, where the hoop ends were pinned, and where stress concentrations form first and propagate last, visibly only after the failure they caused. The vessel had been filled 8 times since its 1810 installation. Each fill was understood by everyone who worked beside it as evidence of the vessel's soundness. None of those fills were evidence of anything except that the remaining structural margin had not yet been fully consumed. Every gallon added was a vote of confidence, and a vote no one in the storeroom knew they were casting against a deficit they had no instrument to measure. By 1814, the Horseshoe Brewery was one of the 2 largest producers of porter in London, its annual output rivaling only Whitbread for the title of the capital's most dominant brewer. The brewery floor operated as a living industrial organism of tightly coordinated sequential functions. The mash tuns where ground malt and heated water combined into sweet wort. The coppers where the wort boiled hard with hops to produce bitterness and drive off infection. The cooling ships where it rested before the yeast was pitched. And then the great wooden vats in the storeroom, where the porter matured under the slow, continuing biological pressure of secondary fermentation. Each vessel's dissolved carbon dioxide, contributing to the warm, gas-laden atmosphere of the storage floor. Each fraction of pressure normalized into the background sensory routine of daily production. The men who worked in that storeroom knew its sounds and its rhythms with the authority of long familiarity. They knew the resonance of the timber when a fresh fill settled against the staves. They knew the smell that collected near the bungholes and thickened toward the floor, heavier than air, stinging the eyes and slowing the breath in enclosed spaces. They had stopped noticing the vibration the vats transmitted through the floorboards underfoot, that low, constant, barely audible presence of enormous mass in motion, of liquid shifting by fractions under the pressure of its own chemistry. It had become the background condition of their working lives, unremarkable and therefore unexamined. George Crick had known these things for 17 years, through the brewery's transformation from a mid-sized London operation into one of the most productive industrial establishments in the city. And what he understood was that the vats occasionally shed their hoops, that hoops were replaced, and that the system continued. He did not have, because no one at the Horseshoe Brewery had a written record of how many times each hoop had been reseated, how many fill cycles had loaded the timber since the vessel was installed, or what structural margin remained against the loads it was actually carrying. The vat was managed through observation and habit. It had never failed before. That was the most dangerous fact in the building. At around 4:30 on the afternoon of the 17th of October, 1814, Crick climbed to the inspection platform overlooking the great vat and saw that one of the 700-pound iron hoops had slipped from its seat. The vat was filled to within 4 inches of its 22-foot rim. holding a 10-month batch of Porter 570 tons of fermenting liquid pressing outward against 59 remaining hoops and the timber they bound, with the internal pressure of continued fermentation adding its own contribution to the load. Crick reported the slipped hoop to his superior and was told, calmly, not to be concerned. This happened 2 or 3 times a year, and it had never caused harm. He descended from the platform, sat at a writing surface below the vats sightline, and began composing a note to the maintenance partner, a Mr. Young, requesting that someone come to reseat the hoop before the next working day. He was holding the unfinished note when, at approximately 5:30 in the afternoon, the vat burst. 1 hour elapsed between the warning and the catastrophe. 1 hour in which a structural deficit was observed, reported, assessed as routine, and set aside while the mathematics of hydrostatic pressure against a compromised containment system continued operating without pause or acknowledgement. Someone had seen it. Someone had written it down. The failure was not a leak. It was not a seam separation or a gradual weeping of liquid through a widening joint. The vat burst a single, total, catastrophic release of everything it contained. The stored gravitational and thermal energy of 570 tons of warm fermenting liquid, converting in an instant into a hydrodynamic pressure event that the brewery's physical structure could not contain and the first of O, surrounding neighborhood, could not survive. The force of the initial release drove the stopcock from an adjoining vessel, which immediately began discharging its own contents. Several hogsheads of porter were destroyed in the cascade, their volumes joining the primary flood. The back wall of the brewery, 2.5 bricks thick, 25 feet high, a wall built to define and protect an industrial operation, was struck by the wave and did not resist it. Bricks were hurled upward and outward by the force of the discharge, landing on the rooftops of houses in Great Russell Street. The sound was heard at distances that witnesses later described as several miles in every direction. The wave that swept through the collapsed wall was 15 feet high at its peak. 15 feet of warm, dense, fermenting porter, laden with dissolved carbon dioxide and carrying the momentum of 570 tons in sudden motion, moving at a velocity that compressed every possible warning interval to zero. 323,000 imperial gallons in simultaneous motion, directed by the brewery's own floor plan and the collapsed wall's geometry into the narrow lanes of the street. Giles Rookery, the factory that had organized the delivery of product through its corridors for years, organized in the same moment the delivery of the flood. It did not spill. It detonated. The street Giles Rookery could not resist what arrived in its streets that evening. 8 acres of densely packed tenement dwellings, home to some of London's poorest families, predominantly Irish immigrants working the city's manual labor and dockside trades. Living in basement apartments and subdivided ground floor rooms, built without structural reinforcement and without drainage channels adequate to move any significant volume of liquid away from the street level, received 323,000 imperial gallons of warm, fast-moving, heavy liquid with no warning of any kind. The Rookery had been described by the Westminster preacher Thomas Beames as a place of perpetual social and structural decay, a neighborhood seemingly always on the verge of collapse. The journalist and social historian Richard Kirkland would later characterize it as a place of chronic overcrowding, where the physical fabric of the buildings matched the precarious economic condition of the people inside them. The wave found every weakness simultaneously. On New Street, a narrow cul-de-sac running directly behind the brewery wall, 2 houses bore the full force of the initial surge. In the first house, Mary Banfield had sat down with her 4-year-old daughter Hannah for afternoon tea when the wave struck the exterior walls. Both were swept away and killed. In the basement of the second house, Anne Saville was holding a wake for her 2-year-old son John, who had died the previous day. Beside her sat Elizabeth Smith, Mary Mulvey and her young son Thomas, and Catherine Butler, 65 years old. 5 people gathered in a cellar to mourn one small death. When the flood struck the foundation above them, the house collapsed inward, and all 5 died beneath the falling structure within minutes of the vat's rupture, At the Tavistock Arms Public House on Great Russell Street, 14-year-old servant Eleanor Cooper had been washing pots at an outdoor pump in the shadow of the brewery's back wall when the wall came down. She was killed instantly beneath the falling brickwork, the wave reaching the wall's exterior face so quickly that no alarm traveled from the storeroom to the street before she was gone. 8 people were dead. The youngest was 4 years old. The oldest was 65. None of them worked in the brewery. None of them had any relationship to the industrial logic that had produced the vessel, grown the vessel, and failed to inspect the vessel across 4 years and 8 fill cycles. They lived beside it. That was the entirety of their involvement. The porter reached several blocks in every direction, filling every basement and low-lying space with warm liquid that cooled and thickened as the evening progressed, becoming increasingly resistant as rescuers waded through it chest-deep, searching the debris fields of 2 collapsed houses. Reports from the scene described men cutting victims free from fallen walls with saws and crowbars, the liquid darkening and congealing around them in the cold October air. The dissolved gas, rising from its surface, in quantities sufficient to disorient anyone who breathed too deeply in the enclosed spaces between fallen masonry. 3 brewery workers were pulled alive from the storeroom flood inside the brewery. Another was recovered alive from the external rubble. The chocolate dark porter reached George Street within minutes of the breach. No one who saw it arrive had time to move. The coroner's inquest convened 2 days later at the workhouse of St. Giles Parish, with George Hodgson, Middlesex coroner, presiding on the 19th of October, 1814. The jurors were conducted physically through the wrecked storeroom and to the scene of the flood before testimony was received. Standard procedure, intended to ground the jury's conclusions in the observed physical reality of the amenity Enderstade. Event. George Crick testified first, and at length. He described the slipped hoop discovered at 4:30. The note he had been composing for the maintenance partner when the vat failed at 5:30. The sound of the burst. The sequence of secondary failures as adjoining vessels lost their stopcocks and contributed their contents to the flood. He confirmed that hoops slipped from the vats 2 or 3 times per year and had never previously resulted in harm. Richard Hawes, landlord of the Tavistock Arms, testified to the circumstances of Eleanor Cooper's death beneath the collapsed wall. Other witnesses described the state of the neighborhood in the flood's immediate aftermath, the collapsed houses, the waist-high liquid in New Street, the difficulty of reaching victims trapped beneath walls that the wave had undermined. The inquest transcript is a thorough and precise document. It accounts for every death with the careful language of official record. It notes the names of the victims, their ages, their locations at the moment of the flood, the manner in which each one died. What the transcript does not contain across its full length is a single question directed at the engineering history of the vessel that produced the disaster. No inquiry was made into the number of fill cycles the vat had undergone since its installation in 1810. No examination was conducted of whether the timber staves had been inspected for fatigue or compression creep at any point in 4 years of operation. No assessment was placed before the jury of whether the stress distribution across 60 iron hoops had ever been calculated against the actual hydrostatic load of 18,000 imperial barrels of fermenting liquid at operating temperature. The physical consequences of the failure were measured with precision. The structural causes of the failure were not measured at all. The inquest produced its verdict on the same day it convened. The 8 victims had lost their lives casually, accidentally, and by misfortune. An act of God. No legal responsibility attached to the brewery. No compensation was owed to the families. The machine was fully documented in its destruction. It was not redesigned in its aftermath. They measured everything the flood had touched. They did not measure what had held it. The financial damage to Mew and Company nearly destroyed the brewery, regardless of the legal outcome. The lost porter, the demolished wall, the ruined vats, and the cost of rebuilding the storeroom amounted to approximately £23,000, a sum of sufficient magnitude to threaten the solvency of even a firm operating at the scale the Horseshoe Brewery had reached by. 1814. Mew and Company petitioned Parliament, arguing that the excise duty already paid on the destroyed product warranted recovery, and Parliament agreed, returning approximately £7,250 from His Majesty's excise. That recovery alone preserved the brewery from bankruptcy. It did not reach the families of the dead. Collections were organized across London for funeral expenses. Bodies of several victims were laid out in a neighboring yard, where members of the public came in significant numbers to pay their respects and donate toward burial costs. The 5 mourners killed in Anne Saville's cellar were given a separate wake at the Ship Public House on Bainbridge Street, the brewery's watchman, demonstrating an institutional pragmatism that the newspapers of the day did not fail to note. Charged spectators an admission fee to view the wrecked vat chambers. Through the holes torn in the back wall, hundreds paid. The porter smell persisted in the streets of Street. Giles for months, rising again on warm days from the stone and timber it had saturated, a presence that no amount of cleaning fully removed from the fabric of the neighborhood. No one who encountered it found it comforting. What followed in the decades after October 1814 was not legislative reform of any systematic kind. No parliamentary act addressed the design or inspection standards for large wooden fermentation vessels. No engineering society published a formal post-incident analysis of the failure mode or its implications for vessels of identical construction still operating across the London brewing industry. The inquest's verdict of misfortune left no statutory obligation on any party to examine, reinforce, or retire the remaining wooden vats in production across the city. What changed instead was the private assessment of brewery owners who had watched Mew nearly bankrupted by a single structural failure and concluded, without any external compulsion, that the risk profile of wooden large-format fermentation vessels had been permanently altered by the event of October 17. The design was not banned. It was abandoned through the slow accumulation of individual economic decisions made across the following decades. Insurance assessments that priced the risk of large wooden vessels upward after 1814. Liability concerns that a verdict of misfortune could not fully extinguish in the minds of brewery directors who understood what the flood had cost even without a finding of negligence, and the gradual availability of lined concrete fermentation vessels that distributed hydrostatic stress more evenly across their geometry, resisted the timber fatigue and joint compression that accumulated invisibly in stave and hoop construction over repeated fill cycles, and did not require 60 iron bands totaling 81 metric tons to hold their contents against gravity. Concrete vessels were adopted brewery by brewery through the latter decades of the 19th century, not through mandate, not through regulation, but through preference. The quiet preference of men who understood what a wooden vat sounded like when it reached the end of its structural margin, and who had no interest in being present when another one did. The wooden fermentation vat at the scale Henry Mew had built, it was not declared obsolete by any authority. It was simply no longer specified. No longer trusted in the way an engineer must trust a structure to put his name against its installation. No longer built. The last vessels of the type retired from active production, not in a single year, but across generations. One replacement at a time, each concrete or steel successor representing a private calculation that the lesson of Street, Giles had been understood, even if it had never been codified. The Horseshoe Brewery itself operated until 1921, when Mew and Company relocated production and vacated the Tottenham Court Road site. The buildings were demolished in 1922. The Dominion Theatre opened on the cleared ground in 1929, its stage occupying the approximate footprint of the storeroom where Crick had stood with an unfinished note in his hand, its audience sitting in the dark above foundations that once transmitted the subsonic vibration of 570 tons of aging porter through timber floors to the boots of every man who worked above them. The vibration is gone. The hum that normalized the presence of catastrophic stored energy above the level of a crowded street is gone. The floor no longer moves. The air in the theater is still and temperature-controlled and entirely free of the fermented sweetness that pressed into every surface of that storeroom. On the afternoon of the 17th of October, 1814, when a clerk who had worked beside the machine for 17 years finished writing a note that no one would ever read, and heard, from 30 feet away, the last sound the vessel ever made, not a warning, not a groan of timber finding its limit, not the slow and legible separation of a failing seam, but the single, total, instantaneous release of everything the machine had ever held. Every gallon, every fill cycle, every hoop that had held and every hoop that had not, every decision to grow the vessel without independent verification, every year of production treated as proof of safety rather than accumulation of debt against a structural margin. No one had ever assigned a number to translate it in one arithmetic moment into a wave 15 feet high and 300 in deader. 23,000 gallons wide, moving through the streets of Street. Giles at a speed no alarm could precede and no resident could outrun, collecting 8 lives from a neighborhood that had no part in building the machine, no knowledge of its history, and no warning that the thing behind the wall had finally, after 4 years and 8 fill cycles and 60 hoops and 81 metric tons of forged iron, reached the precise boundary between the energy it had always stored and the energy it could no longer contain.